Well, here we go again. I didn't think I'd be back so soon with some more Linux drama. As in my previous video, I talked about Hector leaving as a Rust Linux maintainer who was helping to advance the Rust for Linux project. But we now have another maintainer stepping down, as well as an escalation on what's happening with Hector. Now this goes in depth, so I want to read through a lot of this, so I'm going to get started right away. But just a brief recap of the previous video. I covered some drama around the Rust in the kernel and read through some heated email threads in which Linus Torvalds got involved about conflict in using Rust in the DMA and how one maintainer wanted nothing to do with Rust in their specific portion of the kernel. Well, first up, we have more news from Hector Martin as he is resigning as the Asahi Linux project lead. Let's get into reading. Back in the late 2000s, I was a major contributor to the Wii homebrew scene. At the time, I worked on software, people call them jailbreaks these days, to run their own unofficial apps on the Nintendo Wii. I was passionate about my work and the team I was a part of, Team Tweezers, later Fail Overflow. Despite that, I ended up burning out, primarily due to the very large fraction of entitled users. Most people using our software just wanted to play pirated games, something we did not support, condone, or directly enable. We kept playing a cat and mouse game with the manufacturer to keep the platform open, only to see our efforts primarily used by people who wanted to steal other people's work and very loudly felt entitled to it. It really got old after a while. As newer game consoles were released, I ended up focusing on Linux ports purely for fun and didn't attempt to build a community nor work on jailbreaks or exploits that would end up becoming a tool used by pirates. So Hector definitely has a long history of development, whether it's in the Linux space or contributing to other projects like Wii Homebrew. But then they move on to how they really enjoyed getting into Linux. Well, when Apple released the M1, I realized that making it run on Linux was my dream project. The technical challenges were the same as my console homebrew projects of the past, in fact much bigger, but this time the platform was already open. There was no need for a jailbreak and no drama and entitled users who want to pirate software to worry about. And running Linux on M1 was a much bigger deal than running it on a PS4. I launched the Asahi Linux project and received an immense amount of support and donations. Incredibly, I had the support I needed to make the project happen just a few days after my call to action, so I got to work. The first couple of years were amazing as we brought the platform from nothing to one of the smoothest Linux experiences you can get on a laptop. Sure, there were and are still some bits and pieces of hardware support missing, but the overall experience rivaled or exceeded what you could get from most x86 laptops. And we built it up from scratch with zero vendor support or documentation. It was an impossible feat, something that had never been done before, and we pulled it off. And that's definitely something that they did, as the Asahi Linux team has been hard at work developing Linux for the silicon ARM processors that are available on these machines, and especially advancing Linux in a sphere where eventually we're going to see more and more of these ARM-based machines being introduced because they're cheap processors and they're very efficient processors as well. As Apple has brought them really onto the scene, this is a big project that Hector was running. Unfortunately, things became less fun after a while. First, there were the issues of upstreaming code to the Linux kernel, which I've already spoken at length about and I won't repeat here. Suffice it to say, being in a position to have to upstream code across practically every Linux subsystem, touching drivers of all categories as well as some common code, is an incredibly frustrating experience. And then we're going to talk about some of that experience and frustration, but this section really highlights some familiar stuff that Hector already mentioned at the top of their post here. But then also came the entitled users. This time it wasn't about stealing games, it was about features. When is Thunderbolt coming? Asahi is useless to me until I can get to use monitors over USB-C. The battery life sucks compared to macOS. Nobody ever complained when compared to x86 laptops. I can't even check my CPU temperature. Yes, I seriously got that one. Edit. This wasn't just a few incidents. I've seen variations on the first 3 posts 100 times by now, including takes like Thunderbolt/DP alt are never going to happen a few times, but the same thing repeated over and over again every day while trying to make these things happen will get to anybody. And I can definitely see where they're coming from, as notions like this definitely can lead to burnout, especially if your audience or the people that you're trying to produce a product for don't seem to be engaging with what you're producing instead only complaining about what you're producing. I do see where Hector is coming from, and at the very least I can definitely tell how this could lead to burnout, as it did to in his first case as well. And of course, when is M3, M4 support coming? There's always something new, a carrot to chase, so yeah, of course you're going to get those types of things. For a long time, well after we had stable release, people kept claiming Asahi Linux and Fedora Asahi Remix in particular were alpha and unstable, and not suitable for a daily driver despite thousands of users, myself included, daily driving it and even using it for servers. Which again, they're making very great progress on all the ARM stuff, which we're seeing more and more in the server space. So again, really hurts to see that they're stepping down as the lead maintainer here. No matter how much we did, how many impossible feats we pulled off, people always wanted more and more. Meanwhile, donations and pledges kept slowly decreasing and have done so since the project launched. Not enough to spell immediate doom for my dream of working on Asahi full time in the short term, but enough to make me wonder if any of this was really appreciated. The all-time peak monthly donation volume was the very first month or two. It seemed the more things we accomplished, the less support we had. I think this is due mainly to a phenomenon where people are very excited for the new shiny thing, but it's very hard to convert people over to consistently remaining with the project and donating, as that allure tends to dwindle down. I can definitely understand why they're asking themselves if it was ever really appreciated, but that's kind of the ebb and flow, at least with most projects and even products that I've been involved. It's too bad that this led to a burnout. I knew burnout was a very real risk and managed this by limiting my time spent on certain areas such as kernel upstreaming. This worked reasonably well and was mostly sustainable at the time. Then 2024 happened. The last year was incredibly tumultuous for me, and due to personal reasons which I will not go into detail about. Suffice it to say, I ended up traveling for most of the year, all while having to handle various abusers and stalkers who harassed me and attacked me and my family and continued to do so. This is just absolutely heartbreaking. No one should have to go through this, and I really hope that they've been able to make it through this without too much pain. It's really sad to see that people would resort to this kind of stuff, but anyways, we'll keep moving on here. I did make some progress in 2024, good to hear, but this left me in a very vulnerable position. I hadn't gotten nearly as much Asahi work done as I'd liked, and the users weren't getting any quieter about demanding more features and machine support. We shipped conformant Vulkan drivers and a whole emulation stack for the x86-64 games and apps, but we were still stuck without DP alt mode, a feature which required deep reverse engineering, debugging, and kernel surgery to pull it off, and which, if it were to be implemented properly and robustly, would require a major refactor of certain kernel subsystems, or perhaps even the introduction of an entirely new subsystem. I slowly started to ramp work up again at the beginning of this year, feeling very stressed out and guilty about having gotten very little work done for the previous year. Full DP alt support was still a ways away, but we were hoping to ship a limited version that only worked for specific Type-C port for each machine type in the very first month or two of the year. Sven had gotten some progress into the PHY code in December, so I picked it up and ended up beating the code of 3 drivers into enough shape that it mostly worked reliably. Even though it wasn't the best approach, it was the most I could manage without having another huge bike shed discussion with the kernel community. I did try to bring up the subject on mailing lists, but didn't get much response. Definitely getting the sense that they are just trying to keep up and are struggling to do so. And we got a lot more to read here, as I think it's important to hear their perspective, because I feel like a lot of people can resonate with this, especially when they're contributing their time and effort for free and getting no appreciation. The issues Rust for Linux has had surviving as an upstream Linux project are well documented, so I won't repeat them in detail here. Suffice it to say, I consider Linus's handling of integration of Rust into Linux a major failure of leadership. Such a large project needs significant support from major stakeholders to survive, while his approach seems to have been to just wait and see. Meanwhile, multiple subsystem maintainers downstream of him have had their best to stonewall or hinder the project, issue unacceptable verbal abuse, and generally hurt morale with no consequence. One major Rust for Linux maintainer already resigned a few months ago. We covered this a while back, which I believe this is talking about Wetson Almeida. Philo, a software engineer at Microsoft who was overseeing the Rust for Linux project and resigned himself through a message on the Linux kernel development mailing list, as they were lacking the energy and enthusiasm they once had in response to non-technical nonsense. As you know, this is deeply personal to me, as we've made a bet on Rust for Linux for Asahi, not just for fun or just for memory safety either. Rust is the entire reason our GPU driver was able to succeed in the time it did. We have had 2 or more Rust drivers in our downstream tree now, and third one on track to be rewritten from C to Rust because Rust is simply much better suited to the unique challenges we face. And the C driver is becoming unmaintainable. This is, by the way, the same reason that the nouveau driver for NVIDIA GPUs is being written in Rust. More modern programming languages are better suited to write drivers for more modern hardware with complexity and novel challenges, unsurprisingly. As they've definitely been a champion for Rust, and they've realized with their experience that clearly there are some benefits to using Rust, at least for them and their team, to make it easier to write these drivers and programs. It makes a lot of sense why they were so devoted to helping bring Rust into the overall Linux ecosystem. Some might be wondering why we can't just let the Rust situation play out on its own over a longer period of time, perhaps several more years, and simply maintain things downstream until then. One reason is that, of course, this situation is hurting developer morale in the present. Another is that Apple GPU driver is itself major evidence that Rust for Linux is a fit for purpose. It was the first driver to be written from scratch in Rust and brought along with it a lot of development in Rust kernel abstractions. Simply not aiming for upstream might be seen as a lack of interest and hurt the chances of survival of the Rust for Linux effort, but there's more. And before we get to more, don't forget to subscribe below. YouTube can get finicky and you wouldn't want to miss videos like this. Clearly you're enjoying it. Also, take a moment to smash that like button, as more people should hear about this news and understand the perspective of maintainers in the Linux kernel project. Now getting back into things, in fact, the Linux kernel development model is perhaps paradoxically designed to encourage upstreaming and punish downstream forks. While it is possible to just not care about upstream and maintain an outright hard fork, this is not a viable long-term solution. That's how you get vendor Android kernel trees that die off in 2 years. The Asahi Linux downstream tree is continuously rebased on top of the latest upstream kernel. And that means that every extra patch we carry downstream increases our maintenance workload, sometimes significantly. But if it goes deeper than that, kernel Mesa policy states that upstream Mesa support for a GPU driver cannot be merged and enabled until the kernel side is ready for merge. This means that we have to ship Mesa fork to users while our GPU driver is 99% upstream to Mesa. It is intentionally hard disabled, and we are not allowed to submit a change that would enable it until the kernel side lands. This in practice means that the users cannot have GPU acceleration work together with container technologies, such as Docker or Podman, but also including things like Waydroid. Since standard container images will ship upstream Mesa builds, which would not be compatible. We have partial workaround for Flatpak, but all other container systems are out of luck. Due to all of this and more, the difficulty of upstreaming to Linux kernel is hurting our downstream users today. I'm not the kind to let injustices go when I see them, so when yet another long-term maintainer abused his position to attempt to hinder the Rust for Linux and block upstreaming progress, I spoke out. And the response, which has been pretty widely covered, as a lot of Linux community members have covered it at this point, was the last drop that put me over the edge. I resigned from my position as the upstream maintainer for the Apple ARM support, as I no longer want to be involved with that community. Later in that thread, another major maintainer unironically stated that we are the thin blue line that nobody cared, which just further confirmed to me that I don't want anything to do with them. This is the same person that previously prompted a Rust for Linux maintainer to quit. But it goes well beyond public incident. In the days that followed, I learned some of the members of the kernel and adjacent Linux spaces have been playing a two-faced game with me, where they feigned support for me and Asahi Linux while secretly resenting me and rallying resentment behind closed doors. All this occurred without anyone ever sending me any private email or otherwise cluing me in on what was going on. I heard that one of these people, who was a high-level position in multiple projects that Asahi Linux must interact with to survive, had sided with and continues to side with individuals who have abused and harassed me directly. Apparently, there were also implied falsehoods such as the idea that I am employed by someone to work on Asahi. I am not. We have zero corporate sponsorship other than bunny.net giving us free CDN credits for the hosting. And I think this is an important point for Hector to make, as he emphasizes he's not really beholden to anyone, including corporate or external authority here. That way we clear up any misinformation and protect the private integrity that we have for Asahi. And also the fact that Hector is justified to react to this in any way that they want. I get that some people might not have liked my Mastodon posts. Yes, I can be abrasive sometimes, and that is a fault I own up to. But this is simply not okay. I cannot work with people who form cliques behind the scenes and lie about their intentions. I cannot work with those who place blame on the messenger instead of those who are truly toxic in the community. I cannot work with those who resent public commentary and claim things are better handled in private, despite the fact that nothing ever seems to change in private. I cannot work with those who denounce calling out misbehavior on social media to thousands of followers, while themselves roasting people both on social media and on mailing lists with thousands of subscribers. I cannot work with those in high-level positions who have politically charged and discriminatory language in public and face no repercussions. I cannot work with those who say I'm the problem and everything is going great. While major supporters and maintainers are actively resigning, I keep receiving messages from all kinds of people saying that they don't want to touch the Linux kernel with a 10-foot pole. When Apple released the M1, Linus Torvalds wished it could run on Linux, but it didn't have much hope that it would ever happen. We made it happen, and by Linux 5.19 was released from an M2 MacBook Air running Asahi Linux. I had hoped his enthusiasm would translate to some support for our community and help with upstreaming struggles. Sadly, that never came to pass. In November 2023, I sent him an invitation to discuss the challenges of the kernel contributions and maintenance and see how we could help. He never replied. You can definitely see the frustration coming from Hector and what feels like Burnout just trying to constantly fight against all the roadblocks that they've encountered. Again, kind of parroting the whole Burnout that they had with the Wii project that they were working on. Let's keep going here. Back in 2011, Khan Kolivas left the Linux kernel community as an anesthesiast by day. He was arguably the last great Linux kernel hobbyist hacker. In the years since, it seems things have, if anything, gotten worse. Today, it is practically impossible to survive being a significant Linux maintainer or cross-subsystem contributor if you're not employed to do it by a corporation. Linux started out as a hobbyist project, but it has well and truly lost its hobbyist roots. And I think it is actually fair to say that most of today's high-volume or cross-subsystem Linux kernel development is getting done by paid developers, meaning they're already employed by large companies, including Red Hat, Google, Intel, IBM, and Microsoft and the sort. But saying that it's practically impossible, I think that's a little overstated. It is definitely more difficult nowadays because it's hard as an individual to make anything or gain any livelihood from doing open source development. Therefore, a lot of people approach this as a hobby. They do this as a second type of thing, as many people have to depend on private companies to make their living and then contribute to the kernel as a hobby. Now, if you want to talk about how there's corporate benefit from the Linux kernel, well, I think we can definitely argue that one, as they're the ones set out to mostly benefit from all these open source developments where they can easily look through the code and then take out what they want for their own improved security, stability, performance, and even tooling, and quite frankly, benefit from the kernel community. Sorry for that aside. When I started Asahi Linux, I let it take over most of my life. I gave up most of my hobbies. After all, this was my dream hobby, and I spent significantly more than full-time working on that project. It was fun back then, but it's not fun anymore. I have an M3 Pro in a box that I haven't even turned on yet. I dread doing the bring up work. It doesn't feel worth the trouble. Definitely feels like a case of burning out here. I miss having free time where I can relax and not worry about the features we haven't shipped yet. I miss making music. I miss attending jam sessions. I miss going out for dinner with my friends and family and not having to worry about how much we haven't upstreamed. I miss being able to sit down and play a game or watch a movie without feeling guilty. And that's just sad to hear. I really think that this is a great time for Hector to be stepping back and focusing more on some of the other things that they like and enjoy, as it seems like the Linux kernel and the Asahi Linux project has consumed a lot of their life. And now to the main portion with the most effect here. As we saw some warning signs from Hector about not being particularly happy with kernel development, we did not see the fact that they were about to resign as the lead of the Asahi Linux project, because they've done an amazing job with that. It can't go understated with the amount of effort that Hector put in and was successful with. So it's sad to hear this, but I'm resigning as the lead of the Asahi Linux project effective immediately. The project will continue on without me, and I'm working with the rest of the team to handle the transfer of responsibilities and administrative credentials. My personal Patreon will be paused, and those who supported me personally are encouraged to transfer their support to Asahi Linux Open Collective. GitHub sponsors does not allow me to unilaterally pause payments, but my sponsors will be notified of this change so they can manually cancel their sponsorship. I want to thank the entire Asahi Linux team, without whom I would have never gotten anywhere alone. You all know who you are. I also give my utmost gratitude to all my Patreon and GitHub sponsors who made the project a viable reality to begin with. If you are interested in hiring me or know someone who might be, please get in touch. Remote positions only, please, on a consulting or flexible time or non-exclusive basis. We have a contact email. Update, a lot of discussion around this post and interactions that led to brings up the term brigading. Please read the excellent Fetty post for discussion of what is and isn't brigading. I'm not going to get into this update here. Now, to kind of get some thoughts out on this, I do appreciate Hector's take on this. I see how they've been struggling with some of the frustrations of contributing to open source, and I do applaud them for not only their wonderful contributions, especially in the Apple Silicon and ARM space, but also to the fact that they've been doing this for such a long time, simply contributing to open source projects. It's hard to find nowadays, especially people who are good at it, and we can clearly tell that they were good at it. So as it is sad to see them stepping down from the lead of the Asahi Linux team, I do also understand that this seemingly is a great thing for Hector to just take some time off, collect themselves, and move on from having their entire focus be open source. As it was mentioned previously in this post, a lot of their time was spent just thinking about open source and contributing, even feeling guilty just on the sheer fact that they weren't contributing their time to open source. That's a very hard place to be. And if you don't believe so, you probably just haven't dealt with burnout quite yet. Anyways, with all these issues, including the user demandment and entitlement, it seems like it's caused this maintainer to step down. Good luck either way. I do want to briefly touch on what's happening with the Asahi Linux team and what they said. With a heavy heart, we announced the resignation of Asahi Linux founder Hector Martin. His statement on his blog, which we just got done reading: Asahi Linux brings Linux to Apple Silicon, supporting audio webcams, graphics acceleration, and more. As the remaining developers, we are taking this opportunity to build a sustainable project governance. No matter how talented an individual, a large project cannot rest on a single person's shoulders. So instead of replacement, we have 7. And they list all the people taking over in place of Hector and explain the new governance. For those of you interested, I'm going to post a link in the description below. One thing they say is Asahi Linux relies primarily on volunteer contributors, although some contributors have been individual Patreon or GitHub sponsors. Individual funding streams cannot sustain a team. Going forward, our new fiscal sponsor, Open Source Collective, will instead facilitate donations to the project as a whole. And they mentioned that restructure a little bit, just trying to give people an understanding of where support is going to come from, at least monetarily. We continue by talking about some of the new support that's going to come from Asahi Linux, and end with today's news is bittersweet. We are grateful to Markan for kicking off the project and tirelessly working on it these past years. Our community will miss him. Still, with your support, the project has a bright future to come. Clearly, the team is sad to see Hector go as well, sending him off with much appreciation. But just when you think that's all the drama, another maintainer is removing themselves from the Linux kernel. Carol Herbst is going to leave a huge gap in the open source NVidia driver support, as this driver has already historically lagged behind the official drivers. Carol here, who's a Red Hat employee as well, touches on some of the same stuff that Hector had touched upon. And here is the resignation that they posted. I'm going to go through this one as well. Told you this one would be a little bit of a wild one, but I think it's important to cover these topics and just discuss the overall health of the community and maintainers, as if we don't talk about this, we can't make it any better. So anyways, I was pondering with myself for a while if I should just make it official that I'm not really involved in the kernel community anymore, neither as a reviewer nor a maintainer. Most of the time, I simply excuse myself with, if something urgent comes up, I can chime in and help out. Luda and Danilo are doing a wonderful job, and I've put all my trust into them. However, there is one thing I can't stand, and it's hurting me the most. I'm convinced, my core belief is that inclusivity and respect, working with others as equals, no power plays involved, is how we should work together within the free and open source community. I understand that maintainers needing to learn, being concerned on technical points, everybody deserves the time to understand and learn. It is my true belief that most people are capable of change eventually. I truly believe this community can change from within. However, this doesn't mean it's going to be a smooth process. The moment I made up my mind about this was reading the following words written by a maintainer within the Linux kernel community. We are the thin blue line. This isn't okay. This isn't creating some inclusive environment. This isn't okay with the current political situation, especially in the US. A maintainer speaking those words can't be kept, no matter how important or critical or relevant they are. They need to be removed until they can learn what those words mean for a lot of marginalized people, learn what horrors it evokes in their minds. I can't in good faith remain to be a part of this project and its community where those words are tolerated. Those words are not technical. They are a political statement. Even if unintentionally such words carry power, they carry meanings one needs to be aware of. They do cause an immense amount of harm. I wish the best of luck for everybody to continue to try and work from within. You've got my full support. I won't hold it against anyone trying to improve the community. It's just a thankless job. It's a lot of work. People will continue to burn out. I got burned out enough by myself caring about the bits I maintained, but eventually I realized my limits. The obligation I felt was eating me from inside. It stopped being fun at some point, and I've reached a point where I simply couldn't continue to work. I was so motivated doing as I did in the early years. Please respect my wishes to put the statement as is into the tree. Leaving anything out destroys its entire meaning. Respectfully, Carol. Another tale of burnout, and talks about how if we start bringing in politics to the Linux kernel that are perceived as unwelcoming, may be damaging and will thwart off not only community members but maintainers themselves. Basically, the hope here is that there's a little bit of introspection and reform from the community. Either way, it's sad to see another person step down as a maintainer. And I think we are clearly getting some burnout in the community because at this point, we are starting to see the Linux kernel being plagued by drama. And there is a call for leadership, including Linus himself, to try and figure this out, as it's only going to become a bigger and bigger problem. This has been about 4 or 5 maintainers that have left, at least from the Rust for Linux side of things, in the last year, maybe a little less than that. I'm not sure how Linus would actually be able to solve this one himself, but I think it at least opens up conversation to the broader community to discuss these types of things. While some people are blaming Linus for not intervening sooner and even ignoring requests from Hector to hold a meeting, the overall sentiment from the community seems to be a mix of frustration and disappointment across many perspectives. But I think despite disagreements, we all have respect for the contributions of these individual contributors, both Carol and Hector. I personally wish them well, understanding that this burnout seemed inevitable. So what do you personally think about the Linux kernel development community? Should C be the only accepted language? Do you think Rust can eventually find a place? Let me know in the comments section below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you made it to the end of this video, you're a true supporter of the channel. Thank you so much. Make sure to subscribe below. If you haven't already, you clearly like videos like this. Don't forget to smash that like button for me. Catch me in a great community on Discord, and I'll catch you in another video. Thanks for watching. Linux can be hard to understand, but I take the most commonly used terms, commands, and subjects in Linux and I break them down into simple to read documents, including Linux terms, flashcards, a checklist, a cheat sheet, and a mind map. And if you're ready to level up your Linux experience and knowledge, go to SavvyNik.com now and get access to these sheets.